The Philippines, it's one of the most disaster-prone nations on Earth, right? Constantly battling typhoons, earthquakes, you name it. So the big question is, how do you protect a country that's constantly in the path of nature's fury? Well, we're going to dive into a decade of intensive research to find some answers. All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. Think of it like a doctor's visit. First, we'll diagnose the problem. Look at all the risks the Philippines is up against. Then, we'll see what the research says is being done, and we'll uncover this really critical gap between the policy and what's actually happening on the ground. And finally, we'll look at the prescription. What needs to happen to build a more resilient future? Okay, so let's get right into that diagnosis. To really get a handle on the challenge here, you have to understand just the incredible scale of the risk. For the Philippines, the stakes are unbelievably high, and it really all boils down to its unique and pretty dangerous geography. I mean, look at where it is on the map. The country is sitting right at a meeting point of these immense natural forces. Its spot in the Pacific Ring of Fire, that means constant seismic activity. And then, being located in the typhoon belt, well, that basically makes it a magnet for some seriously powerful storms. And this is the result, right? It's not just one thing. It's a constant, relentless barrage of threats. You've got powerful typhoons that trigger these devastating floods and landslides. And at the same time, there's always the risk of a major earthquake or a volcanic eruption. It keeps the entire nation on high alert, pretty much 24/7. So that's the baseline, this constant threat. The next obvious question is, okay, so how do we figure out what's actually working to fight back against all this? And that brings us to our next section, where we're going to look at how researchers dug into a whole decade's worth of studies on this exact topic. So the method they used is called a scoping review. Now, don't let the academic term throw you. Just think of it like this. They're basically creating a huge, detailed map of all the research that's already out there. The point isn't to answer one super specific question, it's to see the whole landscape, what we know, what we don't know, and most importantly, where the big gaps in our understanding are. And this visual, I think, really shows you just how rigorous that process was. They started with 100 potential studies. From there, they screened them down to 50, and then did a really deep dive on 27 of the 4 reports. But in the end, only 15 papers from that 10-year period between 2015 and 2025 actually met their super strict criteria, and those 15 studies became the core evidence for this whole analysis. So, okay, after all that intense filtering, what did those 15 key studies actually tell us? Well, that brings us to the core findings, the big themes in disaster mitigation that have really come to the forefront over the last decade. Well, no surprise here, the biggest theme is a major push to strengthen what's known as disaster risk reduction and management, or DRRM. This is really the bedrock, It's all about creating these solid frameworks for preparedness, response, and recovery, and making sure they work at every level, from the national government all the way down to the smallest local communities. But what's really cool is that the research also pointed to some fascinating, really forward-thinking ideas. Take this one, using social entrepreneurship. So imagine this. Instead of just handing out aid after a disaster, this approach actually helps communities build their own sustainable, locally owned businesses. We're talking about things like debris recycling programs or resilient farming cooperatives, things that not only help with the immediate recovery, but also create jobs and public value long after the disaster is over. It's a pretty powerful idea. And the way we think about recovery is getting broader in other ways, too. Researchers are now really zoning in on the deep, deep connection between disasters and poverty, like how a single typhoon can trap a family in debt for generations. And at the same time, there's this new and vital emphasis on protecting irreplaceable cultural heritage. It's a recognition that, hey, rebuilding a community isn't just about the buildings. It's about restoring its soul. Okay, so this all sounds pretty promising, doesn't it? But here's the thing. This is where the story gets a lot more complicated, because what the research uncovered was a major, major disconnect, a huge gap between all these great plans on paper and what's actually happening on the ground. So on paper, the Philippines has a really strong foundation. There's a national law, Republic Act 10121, that provides a solid policy framework, and you have these incredibly motivated community groups ready to act. But here's the in-practice part. The research found a huge disconnect. That great national policy, it doesn't mean a whole lot if the local disaster councils are too understaffed to actually do anything with it. And those community groups, they can't be effective if their preparedness plans have never even been tested in a real-world drill. It creates a system that's just suffering from weak national oversight. And really, this quote from the study just hits the nail on the head. It says there's a continuing disparity between policy objectives and actual results. And that, right there, that's the core of the problem. But, acknowledging that gap, that's the first absolutely crucial step. So, where does the Philippines go from here? Let's jump into our final section and look at what the research prescribes as the path forward, the path toward real resilience. First things first, we just need more information. The review pointed out some really critical gaps in our knowledge. We need to get a much better handle on what truly makes a community resilient. We need to study how climate change is affecting both social and ecological systems. We need to figure out why information isn't being shared effectively during a crisis. And frankly, we need to know how prepared local governments really are. So based on all of this, the study lays out a really clear 4-part prescription. Number 1, invest in local capacity building. You got to fix that understaffing problem. Number 2, actually test and evaluate the disaster plans. Don't just let them sit on a shelf. 3, prioritize and fund research to fill those knowledge gaps we just talked about. And finally, number 4, push for broader governance reforms to improve accountability across the board. And all of this brings us back to the big overarching question. The Philippines has the policies. It has the community spirit. But for a nation that is living day in and day out on the absolute front lines of climate change and natural disasters, what is it really going to take to finally close that critical gap between a good plan and a plan that actually works in practice?